Last year, after decades of tension and buildup, Russia invaded Ukraine. Initially, the war appeared it was going to be short, but history has turned out otherwise. We're now 16 months in, and Ukraine has surpassed expectations. But the conflict is far from over, and the victor is still undecided. In this time, the war has grown to become the largest conflict in Europe since 1945, with millions of refugees and casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Not to mention the fact that a country the size of Texas, with more than 40 million residents, might see its independence taken away. With the invasion on everyone's minds, questions abound as to the cause. While Russia pulled the trigger, many believe the West played a role as well, going so far as to even blame NATO for the war. The argument goes like this. The US encouraged NATO to expand eastward after the Cold War, entering Russia's orbit and threatening her security. This isn't a ridiculous argument. Security in Europe is a tenuous goal, especially the farther east one goes. Borders are long and easy to cross from both directions. One might think this way of thinking is unique to Putin's government and belongs in the 19th century. But history has shown otherwise. After all, nuclear weapons in Cuba prompted an American blockade. Over the decades, Moscow has watched as countries closer and closer joined the organization. Before the 2000s, Russia and NATO didn't even share a border. But with the admission of the Baltic nations of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in 2004, they suddenly did. St. Petersburg was now only 80 miles from NATO. Now, while Ukraine joining NATO was never imminent or even in view, there were hints indicating its possibility, such as in the 2002 and 2005 talks. The 2008 Bucharest summit was the last straw, where the West promised Ukraine would join eventually. This was, and is, a red line. Ukraine is simply too important to Russia. You see, not only does it have close ties to Moscow culturally, but it was home to a significant naval base at Sevastopol. A Western-aligned Ukraine would enable NATO influence in the Black Sea, hence Russia's primary reason to annex Crimea in 2014. Back on shore, in the event of Ukraine aligning with the West and NATO, Russian security would be all the more difficult, as potentially hostile forces could muster so close to the country's core territory. With stakes so high, chances couldn't be taken. Even worse, this argument purports, is that NATO promised not to expand 1 inch eastward. From their alleged perspective, first we made a deal and then proceeded to immediately break it. The blaming NATO argument, however, hinges on one key idea: that Russia intervened in Ukraine for national security reasons. This appears logical, but is also hard to believe. While it's obvious that Russia has an interest in Ukraine's security situation, one has to ask how one goes from that to leveling civilian infrastructure and government-sanctioned war crimes. If the war was purely about geopolitical concerns, why is Putin talking about Nazis or religious and cultural issues? After all, invading Ukraine and replacing it with a puppet regime wouldn't exactly solve the NATO question. It would result in a buffer, yes, but also in 4 new NATO members on Russia's border. Relations with these new neighbors would be fraught, to say the least. Annexation, worse. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea, which prompted the West to expel her from the G8 and put her under a sanctioned straitjacket. However, the view that Russia was provoked also robs the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe of their agency. Through their respective legislatures and referendums, they alone decided to join the organization. They chose NATO because they had been oppressed by Russia and others for decades, some even centuries. Even today, for most people in the area, Russia isn't a security concern, but the security concern. This couldn't have been better encapsulated by reactions to Putin's war last year, where Russia's actions encouraged Finland and Sweden, some of the few countries that managed to stay neutral during the World Wars and the Cold War, to pick a side. both applied to NATO following Vladimir Putin's fateful decision. NATO, however, is more than just a security guarantee. You see, after the Soviets collapsed, the organization didn't really know what to do. The alliance was created with the sole purpose to protect the Western countries from Russia. But it's hard to maintain a committed alliance when there is no threat to be concerned with, which is why the focus shifted. While some degree of democracy and liberalism had always been requirements to join, they weren't the priority. But as new countries joined in the 1990s and 2000s, the purpose evolved as well.
So in Europe next week, we'll have the chance to strengthen the values we all hold dear: freedom, democracy, security. Our work in Madrid will be a capstone of our nation's leadership throughout the 20th century and a cornerstone for a new age of possibility in the 21st century.
While still a security alliance, NATO also became dedicated to safeguarding values like democracy and free trade within the organization, notably off the coast of Somalia in 2009. The organization became, at least practically, a ticket to join the West. Unsurprisingly, most of the countries that joined NATO after the Cold War also joined the European Union, an economic bloc that wouldn't exist without NATO. This decision to join the West would prove to be the best choice many of these young nations ever made. Let's start with the economies. After restructuring following communism, the economies of Eastern Europe initially suffered, but then, in a miracle, soared. Poland saw its living standards triple between 1990 and 2018, far outstripping the US. The other new NATO members from the Soviet bloc are not far behind. The shortages of the Soviet era were long gone, and working conditions improved as well. With this data, it is no exaggeration to claim that joining the West brought tens of millions of Europeans out of poverty. Not only does joining require nations to pass reforms, which the post-communist countries were already doing, but as I'm sure you can imagine, a free market economy is better for most people than a state-controlled one. Joining those organizations supercharged this growth, as the old members served as markets for those in the East. Poland, in particular, took advantage of foreign investment from the West, and created a massive electronics export industry. They pulled a South Korea, but instead of domestic, they relied on foreign financing, establishing special economic zones and allowing foreign companies like Mercedes to enter the country and lift the economy up. All these changes enabled the country to go 28 years without a recession, even sailing through the 2008 financial crisis. With better living standards powered by joining the West came government legitimacy. Having been puppets of the USSR for decades, briefly independent between the world wars, and occupied for centuries prior by various empires throughout the region, the decade saw most of these countries have their first peaceful transition of power, ever. Rule of law became enshrined, and extrajudicial punishment was removed. Mostly. The story doesn't end there, however. NATO is a security treaty. When a member is attacked, Article 5 will be invoked, transforming an incursion against one into an attack against all. This ensured peace in Europe, as no country, not even Russia, was willing to risk direct conflict with the most powerful alliance in the world. But it also took war off the table as a means of settling disputes between most European nations. While it might not appear so, that last point is likely the most important. The majority of people in the region still believe their country has claims to territory outside their own. According to Pew Research Center, 48% of Poles agree that parts of bordering countries really belong to them, as do 58% of Bulgarians, 6 in 10 Greeks, and 2/3 of Hungarians. It is simply not far-fetched to imagine renewed conflict in Eastern Europe over territorial disputes, especially in the shadow of the war in Ukraine, the struggles over the Balkans, the Greco-Turkish dispute, and the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. As these wars show us, nearby powers could easily have been drawn in, thereby escalating the conflict. Without a security guarantor, decades of peace likely wouldn't have happened. Had NATO not expanded eastward, the new, untested nations of Central and Eastern Europe could have gone down a very different path, with weaker economies and unstable governments. The data is clear. More Europeans than ever live in free societies with free markets and have the ability to speak their mind. Because of NATO, general welfare has never been higher.